It was supposed to be a day of forced, corporate-mandated gratitude. At Apex Innovations, they called it the Synergy Summit Kickoff, which was a fancy way of saying management had bought a pallet of stale pastries from a warehouse club and expected us to be thrilled about it. The lobby was festooned with sad-looking silver and blue balloons. Laminated signs with buzzwords like innovation and disruption were taped to the glass walls of conference rooms, looking less like inspiration and more like a cry for help. The HR team, led by our ever-smiling director Janice, was making the rounds with a squeaky cart, handing out flimsy branded tote bags and single-serving bags of pretzels to everyone who hadn't yet had their soul completely crushed by the fluorescent lighting. It was a hollow, performative charade of appreciation, and we all knew it. I had just finished a grueling 7 a.m. video conference with our development team in Mumbai and was nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, trying to summon the will to live, when I saw it. It wasn't a tote bag. It was a portfolio. A beautiful, expensive-looking black leather portfolio, sitting dead center on my desk like a verdict. It had no Apex logo, no cheerful ribbon. It was stark, silent, and utterly out of place. I reached for it, a flicker of dark humor in my mind suggesting that maybe, after 15 years of service, senior leadership had finally decided I was worth more than a tote bag and a pretzel packet. That's when my manager, Greg, walked past my cubicle. He was mid-stride when he froze, his eyes locking onto the portfolio with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. "Don't touch that," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. I blinked, my hand hovering over the leather. "What?" He didn't look at me. He just stared at the portfolio, a small, nervous tick starting at the corner of his mouth. "Can't you just leave it?" he mumbled, then scurried away, disappearing around the corner like an actor fleeing a scene that had gone terribly wrong. That's when the familiar, cold dread I had been living with for months began to crystallize into something sharp and solid. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just that the portfolio was different. It was the small, laser-etched label on the metal clasp, barely visible unless the light caught it just right. I tilted it. The print was tiny, but my eyes were sharp. My name, Catherine Mercer. My employee ID number. And below it, a timestamp, 3:15 a.m. A shiver went down my spine. 3:15 a.m. That was the time. The witching hour. The exact time that, for the past 6 weeks, a ghost had been creeping into my digital life, silently and methodically rewriting my history at this company. That's when my little side project, a watchdog program I'd named Project Cerberus, had been lighting up with alerts. Look, I know it sounds paranoid, but when you've worked in systems architecture as long as I have, you start to see the difference between a glitch and a footprint. When I first noticed a silent after-hours edit to my internal employee profile last month, an update to my performance review from 3 years ago, dated and timed at 3:15 a.m., I knew. And now, this portfolio. This wasn't a gift. It was a closing statement. I didn't open it. I didn't panic. I took out my phone, photographed the portfolio from every angle, and composed a new email. I addressed it to the internal legal department's general alias. I CC'd the senior-most contact on the company's external compliance board, the one whose name they only ever mentioned in orientation videos to make us feel safe. 10 minutes later, the CEO of Apex Innovations was standing in my doorway. Not his assistant, not a Slack message. Richard Sterling. In the flesh. His posture was ramrod straight, but his face was pale, as if someone had just shown him a picture of his own car careening off a cliff. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice tight. I just smiled, a thin, humorless curve of my lips. I minimized my email and pulled up a folder on my desktop, the one I had been meticulously curating for weeks. The folder was titled, simply, Knife Logs Site. He sat down in the visitor's chair without being invited, which was fine. I hadn't planned on offering him a seat anyway. It had started small, as the most insidious things always do. About 6 weeks before the portfolio appeared, I was working late on a Friday, running a systems diagnostic. As a creature of habit, I always included my own employee file in the sweep. That's when I saw the first anomaly. My security badge access log had an entry for 3:15 a.m. that morning. It wasn't a door swipe. It was a digital file access event. The file touched was a PDF of my project contribution scores from 2 years prior, a file that should have been archived and locked. I checked the metadata. It had been accessed and modified. A single number had been changed, downgrading my contribution score on a major project from lead to support. It was a tiny, almost insignificant alteration, but it was like finding a single, perfectly forged dollar bill in your wallet. It meant the entire currency was compromised. I didn't say anything to anyone. Not to Greg, not to HR. Confronting them without overwhelming proof would have been professional suicide. They would have called it a system error, blamed a server glitch, and quietly buried me. Instead, I went home and resurrected Project Cerberus. Cerberus was a suite of diagnostic scripts I had written years ago after discovering a massive security flaw in our legacy HR software. I had reported the flaw, a backdoor that allowed admin-level access with low-level credentials, but the company, citing budget constraints, had opted for a cheap patch instead of a full fix. They had paid me a small bonus for my proactive initiative and told me to forget about it. I hadn't. I had built Cerberus to be the three-headed dog that would guard that very back door. The script was elegant in its simplicity. It was a tripwire that ran in the background, creating an unalterable, time-stamped log of any access or modification to a designated set of sensitive employee records. It flagged anomalies in login patterns, and most importantly, it quietly mirrored the original, unaltered version of any touched file to a private, encrypted server I controlled off-site. Back then, it was a side project, a way to keep my skills sharp. Now it was my insurance policy. Within 48 hours of redeploying it, the alerts began to pour in. Saturday, 3:15 a.m. Access to Catherine Mercer benefits file. Dependent information field updated. Tuesday, 3:15 a.m. Access to Catherine Mercer direct deposit information. Routing number altered, then reverted 10 minutes later. A test, to see if I was watching. Thursday, 3:15 a.m. A new PDF document, labeled Mercer_peer_complaint_2024.pdf, was created in a hidden HR review directory. The document was digitally signed using my credentials. I had never seen that document before in my life, and no one, no matter how tired, accidentally forges a digital signature at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's when the cold, hard reality of the situation settled in my bones. Someone was building a case against me. Someone was meticulously, patiently, and illegally constructing a false paper trail. And if I had to guess, that paper trail was designed to justify my termination at the most financially opportune moment for the company. Because here's the dirty little secret they don't tell you in the corporate handbook. Your value to a company is a seesaw. On one side is your contribution, on the other is your cost. As a 15-year veteran, with a senior architect's salary and a substantial package of stock grants that were about to vest, my cost was becoming significant. The calculation was changing, quietly. I started taking precautions. Every time I left the office, I unplugged my secondary monitor and packed up my encrypted work drive. Every time Janice from HR sent a cheerful, company-wide email about re-verifying our personal information, I saved a local, time-stamped copy of my existing file before making any changes. Greg, my manager, started acting strangely too. He became distant, avoiding eye contact, his praise for my work becoming vague and non-committal. It was the careful, awkward politeness you extend to someone whose name you know is already on a list you're not supposed to have seen. Still, I didn't confront him. If they were laying a trap, I wanted to see the whole, intricate blueprint before I made my move. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place the weekend before the Synergy Summit. I was at home, peacefully tending to my garden, when my phone pinged with a high-priority alert from Cerberus. Unauthorized access user profile, kmercer/source, HR_master_terminal_01/time, 3 hours 15 minutes and 2 seconds AM. It was the same access point, the same time, for the third week in a row. And 3 times, in a system as supposedly secure as ours, isn't a coincidence. It's a protocol. They had built a pattern. What they didn't know was that I had been building one too, not in memos or meetings, but in silent, unblinking code. And that's the thing about patterns. Once you see them clearly, you stop reacting, and you start planning. Back in the present, that portfolio sat on my desk like it had been hand-delivered by the Grim Reaper in a business suit. The office buzzed around me with the false warmth of the corporate appreciation day, but all I could hear was the steady, rhythmic thump of my own heartbeat. I leaned closer to the portfolio, squinting at the clasp. There, etched into the metal in barely there microprint, was a signature hash. Mine, or at least, the version someone had digitally lifted from an employment form I had signed years ago. I didn't flinch. I didn't call Greg. I didn't storm down to HR. Instead, I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out the portable, high-resolution scanner I kept for my freelance design work, and meticulously scanned the entire exterior of the portfolio. I saved the file to a folder I had created weeks ago, a folder titled, simply, Numb Evidence. Then, I composed my email, cold, clinical, and devoid of emotion. Just the facts. The scan of the portfolio, a brief mention of its unusual appearance and the suspicious timestamp, and a formal request for an immediate review. And then I waited. Not 2 hours. Not 20 minutes. 10. 10 minutes later, Richard Sterling, the CEO, was in my doorway. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The 6 words that confirmed everything I needed to know. I didn't answer. I just turned my monitor toward him and clicked open a file. timeslogs/patterns/internal_edits_metadata_chain.xlsx times. I kept my face blank, my expression unreadable. I let him sit with it. Let him feel the weight of it. Because he knew what they had been doing. And now, he knew that I knew too. What I hadn't yet revealed, what was still held in reserve, was the crown jewel of my investigation. The last metadata pull from Cerberus had captured the name of the final, damning document, the one created at 3:15 a.m. last week. It was a brand new PDF titled Time Disciplinary _Review _K Mercer _behavioral _flags _Q4 times. It was a short, single paragraph of vague, corporate-speak accusations, insubordinate tone in team communications, repeated disregard for internal collaboration protocols, and my personal favorite, non-constructive feedback patterns. But the kicker, the detail that transformed this from a simple, dirty HR hit into a work of surgical, premeditated malice, was the document's creation date. It was exactly 7 days before my next major stock vesting milestone. 7 days. A termination for behavioral issues would, according to my employment contract, nullify that vesting. It was a move that would have saved the company, to the dollar, just over $92,000. It wasn't just sketchy, it was surgical. I was being surgically excised from the company, with precision and with prejudice. The only problem for them was that the surgeon had been sloppy. They had left fingerprints, digital ones. And unlike people, logs don't lie. So no, I didn't need to open the portfolio. I already knew it contained my own, beautifully forged death warrant. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly, patiently, and methodically building a case of my own. And it wasn't a resignation letter. The meeting wasn't a meeting. It was a summons. Mid-afternoon, my Outlook pinged with a calendar update, Leadership Operations Debrief. Conference Room 7B, 2:30 p.m. times. The attendee list was a who's who of the corporate hierarchy. Sterling, the heads of legal and HR, the chief compliance officer, Evelyn Reed, and my manager, Greg. My name was conspicuously absent. The woman whose forged disciplinary memo was the unspoken centerpiece of their agenda was not invited to her own execution. I didn't protest. I just closed the email, took a sip of the bitter burnt coffee I'd been nursing since that morning, and composed one last, critical message. It was addressed to the lead partner at the external law firm listed in our company's compliance charter, a man whose job was to represent the board, not the CEO. The subject line was blunt, urgent, evidence of systemic file tampering and escalation protocol. The only attachment was an encrypted, password-protected image of my entire evidence folder. I hit send. The spider's web began to twitch. This wasn't just a case of one forged document. That would have been reckless. This was orchestrated. Cerberus had revealed the mechanism. They had been exploiting a deprecated macro from our legacy HR system. The macro, designed years ago for retroactive data correction, allowed an admin to insert backdated information into an employee's file without triggering the standard audit alerts. The macro was supposed to have been deleted during a system upgrade 5 years ago. It hadn't been. It had been repurposed. My script had flagged its use across 18 employee profiles in the last 2 years. 16 of them had been exited from the company. All of them were women. 15 of them were over the age of 40. And every single one of them had a major stock or options package vesting within 60 days of their sudden quote performance concerns. I didn't need to dig for a motive. The numbers were the motive. A quick calculation showed that HR had saved the company just over $2.2 million in unvested equity from those quiet surgical terminations. It was a clean, cold, and brutally effective cost containment strategy, disguised as performance management. And Greg, my manager. I had spent the better part of the week trying to convince myself that his whispered, "Don't touch that," was a moment of moral courage, a last-ditch effort to warn me. But then Cerberus had uncovered his digital signature, logged and time-stamped in the macro's authorization trail. He had signed off on my falsified disciplinary memo 32 days ago, the day after a strategic realignment meeting I had not been invited to. His warning wasn't an act of redemption. It was an act of guilt. He couldn't stop the train, but he couldn't bear to be the one to watch it hit me. So he had tossed me a breadcrumb, hoping I'd have the sense to get off the tracks myself. That's the thing about a conspiracy. Everyone is connected, whether they want to be or not. And now, they were all in that conference room, squirming. Evelyn Reed, our chief compliance officer, had gone radio silent since I had CC'd her on my initial email. Janice from HR was still making the rounds with her fake smile, but her emails had started coming from a delegated assistant, another sign of smoke before the fire. I minimized my inbox and watched the conference room through the glass slats of my office blinds. I could see them talking, gesturing, pointing at documents. Sterling slammed a binder closed, and still no one called me in, because they assumed I would wait. They assumed I was playing their game, by their rules. They didn't know that the outside counsel had already replied to my email with 3 simple words: received and acknowledged. Tick-tock. By Monday morning, the atmosphere at Apex Innovations was palpably different. It wasn't louder. It was quieter. And it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the tense, coiled silence of a predator that has just realized it's been caught in a trap. Hallway conversations would cease the moment I walked by. Slack channels would suddenly sprout a series of asterisk, message deleted asterisk placeholders. Janice from HR had vanished. Her office light was off. Her profile picture on our internal directory was replaced by a gray, default silhouette. Someone said she was working remotely for personal health reasons. Someone else said she'd been reassigned to a special project. But when I tried to call her extension, it went to a generic system greeting. She had gone from people leader of the quarter to a digital ghost in less than a week. Evelyn Reed, our esteemed CCO, had apparently gone on a sudden, unplanned vacation. That's what her automatic out-of-office reply said. No location, no return date, no backup contact. Because nothing screams, I am innocent and have nothing to hide, like a sudden, indefinite tropical getaway the day after an external audit is triggered. And the legal department had gone into full bunker mode. The only communication coming from their team was a single, boilerplate statement posted on the company intranet. Noba. We are aware of recent concerns and are conducting a full internal review in cooperation with the board. It was the corporate equivalent of putting up police tape around a crime scene you helped create. But behind that wall of canned silence, I knew something else was happening. The folder I had labeled evidence had grown legs. I started getting quiet, almost imperceptible signals from people in the legal department. A junior associate in the elevator gave me a quick, almost imperceptible nod and a muttered, "Nice work," before looking terrified that he had spoken aloud. The assistant general counsel, a man I had always found to be a condescending corporate drone, requested access to my SharePoint audit trail and pointedly CC'd the vice president of risk management. The wildfire had started, and I had handed them the match and a detailed map of the forest. The evidence was a damning chronicle of a systemic, predatory practice. The same names, Evelyn, Janice, a rotating cast of mid-level HR managers, appeared again and again. But the targets were a chillingly consistent demographic. Women over 40, with significant tenure and equity packages that were about to mature. They hadn't been pushed out with pink slips. They had been meticulously and deliberately poisoned from within their own digital files. I kept quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't send a single "I told you so" email. This wasn't about a triumphant movie ending. This was about a clean, quiet, and complete unraveling. It was about a long, sustained gaslight, finally flickering out. And I just kept doing my job, quietly, professionally, careful not to trip over the wreckage of the careers they had left behind. The board member's name was Ms. DeLuca. She was the senior governance liaison, which is corporate speak for the person the board sends in when they suspect the executives have been setting the company on fire to collect the insurance money. We had only ever exchanged a few formal emails, but I had done my research. She was sharp, discreet, and had a reputation for finding skeletons in closets that everyone else had sworn were empty. I asked her to meet me not in a conference room, but in the old, abandoned innovation lab in the basement, a glass-walled cube filled with dusty 3D printers and the ghosts of failed projects. No one ever went down there. It was perfect. She walked in, her trench coat still damp from the rain, and got straight to the point. "You asked for 10 minutes, Ms. Mercer. You're on the clock." I nodded. No small talk. I pulled a sleek encrypted tablet from my laptop bag and slid it across the table. "Everything is on there," I said, my voice calm. The full, unredacted logs from Project Cerberus. Authorization trails, the deprecated macros source code, Slack message recoveries, and a timeline of the file edits for all 18 targeted employees, mapped against their stock vesting schedules. Ms. DeLuca didn't blink. "There's a pattern," I continued. "Targeted terminations disguised as performance issues. Every case is tied to falsified documentation. The files appear legitimate on the surface, but the metadata and the edit histories tell a different story. And in every single case, the edits were made between 3 and 4 a.m. from admin consoles using spoofed credentials. She crossed her arms. Who? Evelyn Reed and Janice from HR were the primary actors. My manager, Greg, signed off on my forged memo. And one entry, just one, for the initial system override, routes back to an IP address assigned to Richard Sterling's executive suite. She was quiet for a long second. Then she stepped forward and picked up the tablet. "What do you want me to do with this?" she asked. "I've already done what I had to do," I said. "I've gone through the proper channels. This," I tapped the tablet, "is just the part one kept off the grid. The unredacted, unalterable insurance policy. In case the official version gets buried in committee." She weighed the tablet in her hand, and then, for the first time, she cracked the faintest of smiles. It was not a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that says, "The hunt is about to begin." "You built this quietly," she said. It was a statement, not a question. I nodded. "You built this well." Before she reached the door, I said one last thing. "There's a message thread on that tablet, a hidden Slack channel. It's from Evelyn Reed. She asks Greg if it's time for the Mercer protocol." Her words. She even mentions my vesting date. Ms. DeLuca didn't turn around. She just muttered, "They always think Slack is private," and walked out. I stayed behind in the silence of the abandoned lab. But I didn't feel abandoned. I felt resolved. This was no longer about surviving. It was about making sure they didn't. The audit landed like a thunderclap in a library. One day, everything was whispers and nervous glances. The next, Apex Innovations became a fortress of non-disclosure agreements and closed doors. The external audit team arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, a team of stone-faced men and women who moved with the quiet, predatory efficiency of wolves. Interviews began before the office had even finished its first pot of coffee. People were pulled into glass-walled conference rooms and emerged an hour later looking pale and shaken, muttering about metadata and server trails. By noon, an official statement from the board of directors appeared on the company intranet. It was a masterpiece of corporate legalese, talking of serious allegations, a full, independent review, and a commitment to full transparency. It was the corporate equivalent of watching a building burn and promising to investigate the origin of the smoke. Janice and Evelyn were officially gone. An email from the interim head of HR announced they had been separated from the company, effective immediately. Their digital footprints were wiped clean within the hour. It was a quiet, brutal, and efficient execution. But the most significant change was the way people started to look at me. It was no longer with suspicion or pity. It was with a quiet, dawning sense of respect. The other women, the ones whose names were on my list, started coming to me, not in secret, but in the open. They would stop by my desk, one by one. "I think they did this to me too," they would say. They weren't angry. They were just clear-eyed, like people waking up from a long, collective trance. The call came on a Friday morning. It was from a man I didn't know, who introduced himself as the new interim CEO. "Ms. Mercer," he began, his voice oozing a practiced sincerity. "I've been reviewing the audit findings. You were instrumental in bringing these issues to light. What you did took extraordinary clarity and courage." I waited. "We would like to retain you," he said. "We're forming a new transparency and ethics task force, and we want you to lead it. You'd report directly to the board. You would have the authority to redefine our compliance guardrails from the ground up." It was the ultimate prize, the victor's crown, a promotion, a massive raise, and the power to fix the very system that had tried to destroy me. "I appreciate the offer," I said slowly, "but I'm afraid I'm not available." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "I see," he said finally. "I'm sure you do," I replied and hung up. I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it because I had already accepted another job. I had already signed a lease on a new office, the glass-walled kind, with clean, minimalist lines, on the top floor of the building directly across the street from Apex Innovations. I made sure of that when I signed the lease. Nothing too obvious. Just visible. The sign on my new door is simple. It reads, Veritas Analytics. Our tagline is even simpler, truth, with a timestamp. It started with just me, a rented desk, and a server rack I built by hand. Now we're on our third client. The second one came from a whisper inside Apex, from one of the women who had stopped by my desk. She said the same thing they all eventually say. They never thought we would compare notes. On my desk this morning, a package arrived by courier. It was a black leather portfolio, identical in shape and size to the one they had left on my desk during that fateful Synergy Summit. This one wasn't a threat. This one had a note taped to the top, written in the sharp, slanted ink of Ms. DeLuca. It said only, Growth on my dice, we should have listened. Inside was not a forged disciplinary memo. It was a signed contract. A multi-year, 7-figure retainer agreement for Veritas Analytics to serve as the new, independent compliance oversight firm for Apex Innovations. The first quarter's payment was already wired. I smiled. Not a big smile. Just a quiet, satisfied one. There was no revenge. No fiery explosion. No dramatic exposé. There was just the truth. Logged, dated, and backed up to 5 secure mirrors, the same way I had always worked. They had tried to bury me in silence. Instead, I became the one who owns the record.